I will go ahead and introduce our wonderful presenter and myself. If you're just joining us, welcome to the program. We're so happy to have you. I'm Beth, she, her pronouns from Book Group Services, and I will be your staff facilitator today. So best practices for this program are we just ask that you stay muted during Doug's presentation. Feel free to put questions in the comments. I will be monitoring, and this will be recorded for archival purposes. For those of you that have checked out physical copies of the Booktalk collection, I will be monitoring your due dates, and please feel free to email booktalk@mymcpl.org if you have any questions. And then I would love to introduce Doug Richardson of the National Park Service. Doug is about to start has started his 30th year with the National Park Service and has served at 8 national parks in 4 states. Almost 34 years ago, he decided to study history and history education in college, in part inspired by the writing of David McCullough. He has been at the Truman home since January of 2017 and started developing programs with Mid-Continent weeks after his arrival. Truman has always been his dream park, in part because of the book we are discussing today. He and his wife are staunch believers in the public library system, and yes, his wife made him say that last line. So welcome. Thank you, Doug.
Thank you, Beth, and thank you all for joining us. Beth is speaking to us today from the Woodney branch of Mid-Continent Public Library, which is my home branch. I don't live too far from there, and it wasn't all that long ago that I was over at the Woodney branch working, and I found a nice little cubby hole in the corner of the building. And I just wanted to share this before we started today. While I was working, I was just looking around, and in one corner of that building at the Woodney Library Center, there were about 75 to 80 kids plus adults and family members there at story time. There was a significant number of people using computers. There was a significant number of people in the cafe there. The quiet rooms, the reservable rooms were almost all full, and almost all of the other tables were full, and there were people lining up to check out books and lots of people in the stacks. And it just reminded me once again of what valuable places libraries are to our communities, because what I saw in front of me that day was a large group of different people aging from around less than a year old to somebody, probably a gentleman in his mid to late 80s, almost all doing something different. So that library was providing a large number of different services to different people. And it was just really a very satisfying thing for me to see. I very much believe that libraries are just a foundational block of who we are as a society. So it's really an honor to be a partner with Mid-Continent Public Library for this and for the other programs that the National Park Service does. My name is Doug Richardson, and I am one of the park rangers here at the Truman home in Independence. The formal name of our park is Harry S. Truman National Historic Site, but many of our visitors do know us as the Truman home here in Independence, or the Truman Farm home in Grandview. And before we really start with the meat and potatoes of today's story, just another quick anecdote about relevance. Historians are always searching for an opportunity to share about how history is relevant to us. History is always interesting, but it is most important when it is relevant to us. One day last week, I happened to be here late for a special public program, and I left the park at about 7 o'clock at night. And upon getting into my vehicle for my about 25-minute drive home, started the ignition, the radio turned on, and within 2 minutes, I heard the name of Harry S. Truman as part of a discussion. When I got home that night, looking at the news, within about 10 minutes, I saw Harry Truman's name again. The next morning, while getting ready for work, catching up on the morning headlines, I saw and heard Harry Truman's name and photograph once again. So here in 2023, we are hearing this man's name, and we are living still in the world that he and his administration helped to create. And some of you joining us today may have been to the motion pictures this week to see a film, Oppenheimer. And it has been very interesting for me to see the critical and the public response to that film. People going to that film thirsting to have some type of an understanding of that whole story. So all of that together, hearing Truman's name on the radio and on the television and on news pages on the internet, and it's all very rewarding to me. It's rewarding to see our visitors coming here every day, thirsting to learn more about him and to, yes, understand that relevance in his life. So today, we are continuing our journey through David McCullough's book, this 1992 biography of Harry Truman. And if you are joining us for the first time, we certainly hope that this is not the last time that you are joining us. We will be going through this book together. And if you were not able to join us for the previous installments of this program series, The Guided Tour of Truman, Mid-Continent Public Library has these available on their YouTube page, and we also have them available on our park website. So these are available for you to watch at your own leisure. So we thank you for the opportunity to do that as well. And what we are doing with this large, and I'm talking about an over 1,000-page book, a biography of Harry Truman, is taking it in sort of bite-sized steps. And I just wanted to, along the way, share with you some things, some documents and photographs, and sometimes artifacts from the park collection, from the Truman Library collection and elsewhere, that David McCullough used to put this book together in the 1980s and in the early 1990s. And in some cases, share with you some things that might have become available after Mr. McCullough published this book in 1992. So that by the time that we are done with this book at the end of this year, that you have the opportunity to say that you know David McCullough, his family, and his times a little bit better. And so I thank you for the opportunity to do that. This presentation is brought to you by our park, which is a unit of the National Park Service, the United States Department of the Interior, and our friends at Mid-Continent Public Library. And a lot of the materials that I'm going to be sharing with you today are from the collection of the National Archives at the Harry S. Truman Presidential Library and Museum. And I tip my Ranger hat to my friends down the road at 500 West 24th Avenue in the archives and on the museum side for a job well done, as always. So when we gathered last time, we talked about Harry Truman becoming president of the United States on April 12th, 1945. And when Truman became president of the United States, the end of World War II was in sight, but not quite there yet. So Harry Truman inherited a two-front war, one of the fronts still raging in Europe, although that war would end in just a few days by Truman's 61st birthday. Once that was over, then Truman's focus, the focus of the American military and the Allied military effort, would then shift over towards conquering Japan. And Harry Truman, throughout the summer of 1945, was becoming more and more and more familiar with a new weapon of war that had been developed during the administration of President Franklin Roosevelt, the atomic bomb. And of course, that's the story that is told in the new film Oppenheimer. And the decision that Harry Truman had to make that day, it could be argued, was the most consequential decision that any president of the United States ever had to make. And to this day, 78 years later, many revisit that decision, analyze it, and debate whether or not President Truman made the right decision or not. Those discussions are still held to this day. And that's not a bad thing. Now, to the end of his life, Harry Truman maintained that he made the right decision, that it was a weapon of war, one that he had available to him. And by making that decision, he did so knowing that he could and would save lives of American and Allied soldiers, as well as lives of Japanese soldiers and Japanese citizens as well. But it is important that we continue to have these discussions, because that is what keeps history relevant. It is a very, very sad fact of life that every day that era, that World War II era, is slipping away from us. We are losing more veterans of the Second World War every day. We are losing their family members every day. We're losing their children. It's important to remember them, to remember their world. And by having those discussions, it's a way of maintaining that sense of relevance. And I'm sure that many of you watching live today and watching a recording later, many of you could raise your hand very easily and say, I had a relative, a father or a grandparent, an aunt or an uncle, or somebody who was somehow part of what Tom Brokaw correctly called that greatest generation. I know I had several family members who told me that in the midst of World War II, they just weren't sure if it would ever end, or they were nervous as to what their world was going to be like when it would end. They seemed relatively confident that America and our allies were going to win the war, but what would that post-World War II world look like? But once the war was over in Japan, this is the moment that the world waited for. And I wanted to share with you a clip courtesy of the Smithsonian Institution and the Smithsonian Channel aboard the USS Missouri. And when I watched this film clip, I would love to jump into the film clip and talk to the people on board here and just ask them what was going through their minds witnessing one of the most powerful moments in world history.
General MacArthur has deliberately stayed away from the Manila Conference, choosing to wait and come face to face with his conquered enemy on Japanese soil. He flies into Okinawa on August 29, 1945, in his own gleaming C-54 Skymaster Baton. This is the crowning achievement of the 65-year-old conqueror's career. The defeated nation comes face to face with their conquerors on the USS Missouri at the surrender ceremony on September 2nd, 1945. Tokyo Bay is clogged with hundreds of powerful gleaming American fighting ships. At 8:55 a.m., the Japanese delegation reaches the Missouri. Finally, General MacArthur makes his entrance with Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz and Admiral William Halsey.
It is my earnest hope, and indeed the hope of all mankind, that from this solemn occasion a better world shall emerge out of the blood and carnage of the past. A world founded upon faith and understanding. A world dedicated to the dignity of man and the fulfillment of his most cherished wish for freedom, tolerance, and justice.
The signing of the surrender signals the official end to a savage conflict. After the Japanese, it's MacArthur's turn. Then come the representatives of 9 other Allied powers. As the Japanese are led away, the victors put on one final display of triumph. 1,500 planes, Boeing Superfortresses, and Navy fighters roar across the sky.
We must never forget. And so much respect to every soldier and sailor and Marine who was part of the greatest generation, and to their families and friends and loved ones who kept the home front. Much respect. Again, we can never forget. And so now, just as President Harry S. Truman helped steer the ship of state through those last few months of World War II, he now must steer the ship of state into peacetime. And much like Woodrow Wilson and Warren Harding a few decades before, Harry Truman was about to find out that it wasn't going to be a very easy job, but he knew that the American people were going to be the American people, and they were going to do what the American people could do for America to take its place as the greatest country in the world in this post-World War II era. But how would Harry Truman help transition America back into peace? There were some logistical problems that America had. We had millions of soldiers who were serving in the European theater of the war, who were serving in the Pacific theater of the war, who in that period of transition of drawdown made that transition from being in the military back to civilian life. For so many, that is never easy. That is never easy. In 2023, that is still not easy, but today, perhaps we have a few more resources to help folks make that transition. in 1945, that was quite a difficult transition for a lot of our returning soldiers and sailors and Marines and guardsmen. There were housing problems across the country, price controls, and some economic turbulence leading to inflation. So everything from meat prices to dairy prices to housing prices to rubber prices to automobile prices. America had struggled for so long, first as a result of the Great Depression and then shortages from the Great Depression, and then with mobilization and sacrifices for mobilization for the war, and then post-Pearl Harbor and America entry into World War II. America had a relatively short amount of time in this post-World War II era to try to land itself on its own 2 feet. And so what Harry Truman tried to do was find a path through which he and the federal government and state and local governments, business and industry, and the American people could all work together to navigate this post-war turbulence a little bit. One of the things that had been on Harry Truman's mind for a long time was the idea that so many Americans across the country had really nothing in the way of medical and dental insurance. And in particular, Truman was very aware that many of veteran service didn't have much in the way of medical and dental insurance. But for the population at large, one of the things that Harry Truman, of course, a former United States Senator, wanted to encourage his former colleagues on Capitol Hill to consider was, in this post-World War II era, a program by which there would be some type of a national health insurance plan for all. Now, much like today, there were national for-profit and some not-for-profit personal health insurance plans, like the Blue Cross plan, the Blue Shield plans, and some others. There were some that were designed specifically for federal employees, for example. But again, Harry Truman knew that there were many across the country who had no such plan available. And much like today in 2023, knew that any type of medical emergency, whether it be a coronary problem or a problem with any type of a cancer or an automobile accident, could financially ruin an individual. And so one of the proposals that Harry Truman encouraged his former colleagues up on Capitol Hill to consider was a national health care plan. Sound familiar? This is in 1945 and 1946, but even so, back then there was opposition to that. And so I wanted to share with you a letter from March of 1946, where Harry Truman encourages one of his former colleagues, a fellow Democrat, Senator Murray, to lobby on behalf of this idea, the idea that the government, through the purchasing power, through the coordination of the federal government, could help provide an additional safety net for people. In Harry Truman's mind, and remember, Harry Truman was in every way, shape, or form a New Dealer. But in this post-World War II era, there were some people who were starting to feel a little New Deal weary and were anxious, even among Democrats that were even ready to try to move into a post-New Deal era. But in short, Truman just wanted to help people. And a lot of this, I really believe, could come back to Truman's knowledge of knowing people here in Missouri and Jackson County, Missouri. There are people in his family who had next to nothing, and in some cases, nothing in the way of any type of health insurance. When Harry Truman was working on the farm in Grandview, he knew of people who had nothing. He and his family had nothing in the way of any type of health insurance in the 1910s, when his parents both had hernia operations in 1914. They had nothing in that regard. Harry Truman's father died of stomach cancer in November of 1914. That caused a financial hardship. And much like today, he knew that it would only take an event like that to push a family into financial ruin. As Truman got involved in local politics here, as he talked to his constituents, whether they were Democrat or Republican, independent, whether they were rabbits or goats, if you remember that part of the story, he got to know them and their families and their situation. And this had been on his mind for a long time. And Truman saw this as a logical successor to things like the Social Security Act. And he saw this as a logical successor to what Franklin Roosevelt had envisioned for America. But what Harry Truman probably wasn't quite expecting was the pushback that he was going to receive, not only from Capitol Hill, but from some in the public and some in business. So I wanted to share with you another document. This is from the Truman Library collection, from the files from the National Health Insurance files, where a businessman from Iowa, a gentleman who owned a feed company, says, hey, we have been following with very much interest what you have been proposing about national health insurance. And he says there's sort of a difference between the words and the action. And this particular business owner, he says this is going to have an adverse effect upon the bottom line of business. And he tries to put it into a little bit of a dollar and cent mode. He says that if you have an individual who makes $25,000 a year, that if that individual is having 4% or so taken out to cover the premiums for this national health insurance program, that person might be able to afford it certainly a lot better than an individual who is making, say, $3,000 or $3,600 a year. And what this letter showed is that there were a significant number of business owners who, on business grounds, on political grounds, and some on constitutional grounds, not so sure that the federal government had the constitutional authority to do this, that they were going to oppose Harry Truman on this. And so it sounds familiar. This is what we still experience this today, right? Well, we get into December of 1945, Harry Truman's first holiday season as president of the United States. By 1945, America really had a lot to be thankful and grateful for. you really do sense, and I'm sure if you do have those in your family who were are part of the greatest generation, they would tell you that there were parts of that Christmas that were bittersweet. That as one of my uncles once told me, he said, yes, that first Christmas after the war was sort of bittersweet. There were members of our family who didn't come home from the war. And so there were countless American homes that had fewer people sitting at the Thanksgiving and Christmas dinner tables. So that part of the holidays, certainly very sad and again, very bittersweet. But by Christmas of 1945, America could, on the other hand, rejoice now that the war was over. Just as many people called World War I, hopefully the war to end all wars, many people now hoped and prayed that the Second World War would now be the war to end all wars. Harry Truman was very much not only looking forward to coming home to Independence and Grandview and Jackson County, Missouri, but he too was looking forward to this first holiday in this post-World War II America. Mrs. Truman, their daughter Mary Margaret Truman, and Mrs. Truman's mother, the lovely Madge Gates Wallace, they had left Washington, D.C. a few days before Christmas, 1945, so that some of the logistics and such could be taken care of back here in Independence. And that left Harry Truman alone in the White House once again. And that always bothered President Truman. He had by this time developed a few nicknames for the White House. He called it the Great White Jail, the Great White Sepulcher. He missed it when his family wasn't there. It wasn't the same having his cabinet or his staff there. He missed his wife and his daughter and his mother-in-law and other family members there, his mother-in-law. He did have the opportunity to light the national Christmas tree on in Washington, D.C., but he was anxious to come home. The problem was that as December 25th tends to do, it could get pretty nasty in the Beltway. December 25th of 1945 was an absolutely horrible day in Washington, D.C. The snow was flying, the ice was flying, roads were impassable, ice everywhere. The municipalities in and around DC just couldn't handle it, and DC was just paralyzed. My neck of the woods in West Central Pennsylvania paralyzed because of horrible weather. But Harry Truman wanted to come home. He wanted to come home. And when the President of the United States says he's going home, he's going to go home. Well, against the advice of his advisors and against the advice of the powers that be in the military, Harry Truman ordered his plane to be prepared. And I wanted to show you there on the left side of your screen the scene as the airplane was about to leave Washington, D.C. And this was one of the first scandals to hit the Truman administration. And here's the scandal, that Harry Truman flew home on Christmas. Here's why it was a scandal. It was said that Harry Truman took an unnecessary risk. Why was it an unnecessary risk? Not only because of the weather, but because Harry Truman, because he was president of the United States, who became president because he was Franklin Roosevelt's vice president. Harry S. Truman, in December of 1945, he had no vice president. If heaven forbid, something were to happen to President Harry S. Truman as a result of this trip back home to Missouri on Christmas Day, 1945, there would have been potentially a serious constitutional problem and a problem with continuity of government. Well, that flight must have been absolutely harrowing with the ice and the snow and the winds. And he got to Kansas City and the reporters were there, and Truman, as always, was full of that wonderful Harry Truman smile. He made his way from the airport at Kansas City to 219 North Delaware Street. There was no black fence or gate up around the home as you would see today. Of course, there was Secret Service presence there, but Truman made his way inside of the home. And while we don't know exactly what went down inside of the home, according to their daughter, Mary Margaret Truman, in her book, she said that Harry Truman and the First Lady, that they had words. And that Mrs. Truman told her husband that, well, it's about time that you came, or you might as well have just stayed for all that I care. So it must have been very tense inside of 219 North Delaware Street. So tense that when Harry Truman made his relatively quick return to Washington, D.C., according to Margaret Truman, he wrote a very angry letter to his wife, the First Lady. And sometimes we do that. In 2023, we may do it differently with maybe an angry email or a text message or something like that. But he wrote something to her. Now, what specifically he wrote to her remains a mystery and will always remain a mystery, because Margaret remembered in her book, Bess W. Truman, that her father, the president, called her and told her to go to the post office, said, I wrote your mother a letter. I don't want her to see it. Get that letter and burn it. So Margaret obeyed her father, retrieved the letter, and burned it. And so we will never really know what was inside of that letter in all likelihood. But then Truman sat down and he wrote another letter on December 28th of 1945 that is very wistful as well. And I wanted to share with you, as you see on the screen there, a little part of that, where he says, you can never appreciate what it means to come home as I did the other evening, after doing at least 100 things I didn't want to do, and have the only person in the world whose approval and good opinion I value look at me like I'm something the cat dragged in. I wonder why we are made so that what we really think and feel, we cover up. There's a reason that I wanted to share this story with you. Not that I wanted to add a little bit of juice or gossip to the presentation, but to show that inner family dynamic and the humanity. These are humans. These are humans. And this is a very human part of the Truman story. But at the very least, the president was able to spend a few hours home with his beloved family on that first Christmas after World War II in 1945. And there's a beautiful tree that sat in the living room at 219 North Delaware Street. Not many of our presidents have a slogan. And I tried to think about that the other night, and I can't think of many American presidents that have a slogan. President Truman is one of them, and that was courtesy of one of his most trusted aides, a fellow by the name of Fred Canfield, who I thought about it last night. I think next month for our next presentation, I'm going to put a little bit of a spotlight on Fred Canfield. Fred Canfield continued to serve in the federal government. He was United States Marshal for the state of Missouri. Fred Canfield was the one who procured and found and bought the famous "The Buck Stops Here" sign that briefly sat on the desk of President Harry S. Truman in the Oval Office. Now, contrary to popular thought, myth, lore, legend, whatever you want to call it, it did not sit on Truman's desk for the entirety of the president's term. It's not exactly clear how long it actually sat on the president's desk, but however long it was there, it certainly captured the imaginations of everybody who saw it, that the buck stops here. That is a wonderful old line that does have its roots, ironically and wonderfully, appropriately, in the game of poker, which Harry Truman was very fond of playing. And that's one of the reasons why so many people today in 2023 want to make that connection to Harry Truman, is that phrase, "the buck stops here." That Harry Truman had that ability to make that decision, to gather all of the information that he could, absorb all of the advice and consent and everything that he could, make a decision, go with it, and stay with that decision. And then whatever happens with that decision, the consequences fall purely on the shoulders of the president. And that became a trademark of Harry Truman. Now, less known is what was on the other side of the "buck stops here" sign. So in case you've never seen it, I wanted to show that to you. And that is the original "buck stops here" sign that is now on exhibit down at the Truman Library. The other side says, "I'm from Missouri." And so indeed, the buck stops here, I'm from Missouri. And so people to this very day, that slogan, that line still means a lot to a lot of people. I wanted to share with you a little bit of the famous speech given here in Missouri by Winston Churchill. Every time I hear this phrase in this speech, it reminds me of a rhetoric teacher that I had in undergraduate school all those years ago, who simply said, "Words matter. No matter what language, what tongue you speak in this world, words matter." And so when Winston Churchill accepted the invite to come to the United States and speak, his words mattered. And the words really changed the course of foreign policy. So here is a little bit from the famous speech.
Kennan's telegram alarmed Washington. Days later, its message was reinforced when Churchill arrived in the United States as President Truman's guest.
They began to get to know each other. Our president said to Mr. Churchill, "I will be on this trip quite a while, and I would be glad if you would call me Harry." Well, Mr. Churchill said, "I'll be glad to if you will call me Winston." Mr. Truman said, "I don't believe I can do that." He said, "I consider you the first citizen in the world, and I just don't believe I can call you Winston." Winston Churchill said, "If you can't call me Winston, then I can't call you Harry." The president said, "On that basis, we'll do it." So it went to Winston and Harry from that time on, and they got on very well.
Churchill was due to speak to a college audience at Fulton, in Truman's home state. Privately, he showed Truman what he was going to say. The president, not sure that the American public was ready for an attack on its wartime Soviet ally, let Churchill test the water.
Mr. Churchill, he's one of the great men of the age. He's a great Englishman. He's a great Englishman, but he's half American.
from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe. Except in the British Commonwealth and in the United States, where communism is in its infancy, the Communist parties, or fifth columns, constitute a growing challenge and peril to Christian civilization. Whatever conclusions may be drawn from these facts, in fact they are, this is certainly not the liberated Europe we fought to build up, nor is it one which contains the essentials of permanent peace.
Immediately after that, Stalin came out with answers to a foreign correspondent's questions in which he compared Churchill to Hitler and decried Churchill's speech as a belligerent call to arms against Soviet Russia.
Kennan's telling.
And that phrase, Iron Curtain, we still hear that phrase to this very day. And almost as important as the words Iron Curtain, if you watch Churchill carefully, the gesture that he made with his left hand, dropping his left hand, almost illustrating the curtain, that was important too. I want to share with you this fun little clip, and kudos to the audiovisual archivist at the Truman Library for digitizing this. Here in Independence, Mrs. Bess Wallace Truman and her sisters-in-law and many of her friends here in town had a bridge club that met regularly, sometimes at 219 North Delaware Street, and they would rotate along to their respective houses. And at one point in April of 1946, Mrs. Truman's Bridge Club went to Washington, D.C. So some of you watching today or watching the recording later, you might have had relatives here locally who were part of Mrs. Truman's famous Bridge Club, and maybe they're in this film clip. So the first time I saw this clip, I was so excited, and I'm glad that they were, at least in this instance here, preserved on film. So it is a silent clip, but Mrs. Truman's Bridge Club in Washington, D.C. I don't know if any of you play bridge. I would love to learn how to play bridge. It's a fascinating game, and I would love to learn how to play it. And this is one of those silent clips. You could see mouths moving, and I wish we knew what they were saying or laughing about or smiling about, or this wonderful smiles. And there's Mary Margaret. And the Bridge Club continued to meet even after the Truman presidency was over, and continued to meet for many, many, many years. I just love that clip. Here's a question for you. How much power does a president of the United States have? And again, that word relevance, and I know one recent proposed labor problem with the Teamsters and UPS, I believe, has been resolved, but I know a few days before that was on the radar as potentially being problematic, and again on the radar. And you watch the news, we're watching a struggle in the entertainment industry and in some others. In this post-World War II world, as you read in the book and as you'll read elsewhere, there were problems in the labor world, but in this case with the railroads. And so Harry Truman did make a rather startling proposal when the railroad went out on strike. And so in 1946, with the railroad strike, and it may seem sort of foreign to us today because railroads aren't necessarily the prominent players that they are today, although they're still quite important, absolutely quite important. But in 1946, everything from food to transportation to mail to everything, railroads were like our carotid artery, our aortas in the country. Was Truman's proposal to draft striking railroad workers into the military, was that his best moment? Was it his worst moment? Or do you think it was a poker player's bluff? It ended up being moot, but what would have happened had it gone to court? Now, we'll talk about this in a subsequent chapter, but when there was a steel strike a few years later, Truman used the powers of the government to seize the steel mills that was determined to be unconstitutional. Would he have had that same fate with the railroaders strike? If you want to put your answers in the chat, do you think that this was Truman's best moment, a worst moment, or a poker player's bluff? Here's another really neat film clip. Beth, are you hearing that one?
No, it's not coming through.
Not coming through. I'm not sure why this clip isn't playing, but this is the famous dramatic moment where Truman is making his pitch to Congress that he wants to draft striking railroaders into the military. And in the midst of the speech, he is handed a message where there it is, where he is told that the strike has been settled by the terms acceptable to the President of the United States. It could not have been staged any better. Now, it wasn't staged, but if it had been staged, it could not have been staged any better. Just an absolutely dramatic moment. And yes, indeed, as Truman said, we'll think about the law later. All right, what I'm going to do here. I'm going to try it again, Beth.
Okay.
Kennan's
No sound for that one either.
No sound,
Wonder why the sound stopped playing.
because I could hear it on the other ones.
The reason I wanted to share this particular clip is that it does feature two prominent players. One is Clark Clifford, who was Harry Truman, one of his new legal advisors, but then also David McCullough is also featured. This is from a 1994 documentary on Harry Truman that was part of the PBS series, The American Experience. So in 2012, in President Barack Obama's first midterm election, President Obama didn't do so well in the midterms. That'd be 2010 midterms, I'm sorry. And President Obama said that he took a shellacking, That was a great phrase that he used. Well, Harry Truman took a shellacking. And as a result of the loss of the midterms, the House of Representatives gained 55 seats and took the majority in the House of Representatives. And in the United States Senate, the Republicans gained 12. And note the state of Missouri, now the Republicans had both seats of the United States Senate in the state of Missouri. So now Harry Truman, a Democratic president, now had both houses of Congress in the opposition party. Truman was not the first to have that, and he would not be the last to have that. But in his annual message, which is really sort of a formal name for the State of the Union speech on January 6th of 1947, I chose these excerpts to share with you. And if I were a speechwriter writing for a president of the United States, preparing a State of the Union speech, and if my president happened to be speaking to two houses of the opposite party, I would use these lines as sort of templates that I am the 20th president of the United States who at some point during the term of his office had found his own party to be in the minority in one or both houses of Congress. The first one was George Washington, Wilson number 18, Hoover was number 19. There are ways of disagreeing. Men who differ can still work together sincerely for the common good. Now, this year, 2023, is the 75th anniversary of the famous 1948 Whistle Stop campaign, which we'll be talking about next month. Harry Truman, as he crisscrossed the country, whistle stopping and campaigning, would rail against what he called the do-nothing 80th Congress. But that was politics. One thing Harry Truman would tell you is that he and that Republican Congress, that Republican House, the Republican Senate, he and they were able to do good things together, not only for the United States, but for the world. And here comes an example here in just a few minutes. And so absolutely, and Truman would say that that's the obligation that a president and our elected leaders have, despite our differences in political party, of helping one another. Also in 1947, America had a new Secretary of State in George C. Marshall. They're sworn in by Chief Justice Vinson, January of 1947. Harry Truman and the 80th Congress started to transform the world. And as I briefly shared this with you, this is purely a coincidence, but yesterday, while talking with a couple here at the Truman home, talking to this couple about where they're from and what brought them here to Independence to learn about the Trumans, the lady said, Harry Truman probably saved my great-grandparents' lives. And I said, well, how's that? And she said, my family comes from Turkey. And as a result of what has been called the Truman Doctrine, President Truman likely saved my family's life. And so here is an example of how President Harry S. Truman, with the assistance of his cabinet, worked together with Senator Vandenberg and members of the United States House of Representatives. And they craft this legislation and they appropriate $400 billion to help prop up Great Britain and Greece and Turkey. And the key words are in the legislation that I have there. The seeds of totalitarian regimes are nurtured by misery and want. They spread and grow in the evil soil of poverty and strife. They reach their full growth when the hope of a people for better life has died. We must keep that hope alive. The free peoples of the world look to us for support in maintaining their freedom. If we falter in our leadership, we may endanger the peace of the world, and we shall surely endanger the welfare of our own nation. Great responsibilities have been placed upon us by the swift movement of events. They knew that they had to act. If Greece and Turkey and then Great Britain were to fall, then, as would be called later the domino theory, the dominoes would fall elsewhere. And so the so-called Truman Doctrine, the aid to Greece and Turkey, this investment of $400 billion, indeed helped save the lives of an unknown number of people. And so that's why that lady got misty-eyed yesterday, over 75 years later. I wanted to share with you just a few interesting documents. I am not a doctor. I do not play one on TV, but David McCullough mentions a little bit about the president's health. Harry Truman did have a physician, a local fellow, General Wallace Harry Graham, and the president's health records are now part of the Wallace Graham papers at the Truman Library. Again, I am not a doctor, so I can't read any of this stuff. I don't understand what it means. All I know is, like you, I get my blood drawn and my doctor yells at me when my numbers don't look good. You can see the president's cholesterol at 120 milligrams. I don't know if that's good or not. There's his eye prescription and how his eyes were looking. Harry Truman, if you remember from the beginning of this series, he suffered from what was called flat eyeballs. So he wore very thick eyeglasses, was legally blind in one eye. But I also wanted to reproduce for you the president's EKG. I don't know what those lines mean, but in essence, the notes say that there was really no evidence of anything bad. Now, President Truman, he did suffer from what is called cardiac asthma and tension headaches and things like that. But Dr. Graham did say that while the stress of the job did affect Harry Truman, but the president was in relatively good health and that his physical appearance was good, his weight was maintaining, he maintained a ruddy, healthy glow to him at all times. The question of who is loyal and who isn't, this is one of the controversies of the Truman administration. Executive Order 9835 on loyalty in the executive branch. This reminded me of when I first became a federal employee almost 31 years ago, how I even had to sign in the early 1990s, I had to sign a loyalty oath saying that I would preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. And this is at a time where the House Un-American Activities Committee was meeting in the House, and there were questions as to what extent communism and socialism was infiltrating into business and politics and the entertainment world and such. And there was concerns that communists were interfering into the federal government. And some people said that, yes, Mr. President, even if you consider move down this road of requiring loyalty oaths of citizens, that even though I may be a Democrat, I may be liberal, what have you, it may cost you my vote. I wanted to share with you two from 1947, June 19th of 1947. Harry Truman took another very important step in that he would be the first president of the United States to address the NAACP. Now, in sort of a lighthearted moment, he remarked that, well, his mother isn't going to like this and what he was going to say. But as he told the NAACP on the Mall in Washington, D.C. that day, he said, the way ahead is not easy. We shall need all the wisdom, imagination, and courage we can muster. We must and shall guarantee the civil rights of all our citizens. Never before has the need been so urgent for skillful and vigorous action to bring us closer to our ideal. And perhaps the most famous line from that speech, when he's talking about freedom for Americans, he said, and when I say Americans, I mean all Americans. This is going to be important next month as we talk about Executive Order 9948. And speaking about his mother, in July of 1947, President Harry S. Truman lost his mother, Mrs. Martha Ellen Young Truman. Just a few weeks before she died, Harry Truman wrote a last letter to his mother, and there's a piece of it there. He didn't make it here to Missouri in time to say goodbye to his mother, and I'm sure that that ate at him for the rest of his life. But to pause and just think a moment about the life of Martha Ellen Young Truman, born in 1852, 9 years before the American Civil War started, died in July of 1947. She lived into the nuclear age, the radio age. She lived to see her son living in the White House. But as important as that is, and as wonderfully American as that is, when somebody would ask Martha Truman, Maddie Truman, are you proud of your son? She would say, well, which one? I have one who lives down the road. He's a farmer, and I'm just as proud of him too. And I have a daughter as well, and I'm proud of her too. So she was proud of all of her children and all that they accomplished.
My mother was a very independent woman, but a very fair woman. She was inclined to say what she thought. And sometimes I think perhaps she was somewhat misunderstood because she was so matter of fact. But she had very high ideals and fine principles, and she tried to teach it to all of us children. I think she might have succeeded partly. Anyway, my mother loved people just as my brother Harry does.
And that's Mary Jane Truman remembering their mother. It's not cheap to be president of the United States. I wanted to share with you not only President Truman's income tax return for 1947, showing his income of $75,000 as president of the United States. His tax rate was just about 50%. But he also, as all presidents have to, he was responsible for the food bill for himself and for his family. His food bill came to $518.88 for the month of June of 1947. And according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, that equates about $7,197 today. So it was not cheap to be president of the United States. And all of President Truman's tax returns are available for you to see in the Best W. Truman papers at the Truman Library. And I did want to give a little tip of the hat to Miss Rose Conway, who was born in Emporia, Kansas in 1900. And as a very young child, her family moved to Kansas City. She became associated with the family when she first started working for Harry Truman's brother, John Vivian, when he managed the Federal Housing Administration. But then one day, John Vivian told his brother, hey, I've got this marvelous young lady working for me. Maybe she could come work for you. And Harry Truman took advantage of that offer. Miss Conway started to work for Vice President Truman. Miss Conway continued to work for Harry Truman for the rest of her life. Miss Conway continued to serve President Truman in the post-presidential period up until the day that President Truman died, and continued to work at the Truman Library until she retired in the mid-1970s. And Miss Conway was even made an honorary member of Battery D, the 129th Field Artillery. So when we talk about that important network of family, friends, and associates important to Harry Truman, we simply cannot forget Miss Rose Conway. I only regret that nobody seems to have been able to have captured her voice on film or on tape anywhere, and that was by choice. She never gave an interview, and I very much regret that. And towards the end of the chapter, Mr. McCullough makes reference to a portrait that Harry Truman sat for by a wonderful artist by the name of Greta Kempton. And that is the beautiful painting there with the United States Capitol in the background, a building that just meant the world to Harry Truman. He loved the United States Capitol. And that painting means a lot to all of us. And Miss Kempton did a lot of beautiful artwork of the Trumans. Not only that portrait, she did a portrait of Harry Truman as a Mason, did a beautiful portrait of Mary Margaret Truman that I'm going to share with you next month, did the First Lady portrait of Mrs. Truman that I'm going to share with you, and then a few other portraits of Margaret Truman and two of her sons as well. So Greta Kempton is one of our great portrait artists in the United States. So the next time that we are together on Thursday, September 7th, 2023, it is going to be jam-packed, my friends. We are going to have what is often called the Marshall Plan, the recognition of Israel from May of 1948, the Berlin airlift, the 1948 campaign, Harry Truman desegregating the United States Armed Forces and the civilian workforce. The House Committee on Un-American Activities continues to meet. The 1948 Whistle Stop campaign and the campaign against Governor Thomas Dewey and all of the polling and all of that. So 1948 is one of the pivotal years in our history, and this is the 75th anniversary of all of that. So I hope that you will consider joining us on that for September 7th, 2023. And as always, if there is anything in this presentation that you would like a copy of, please feel free to drop me an email at djrichardson@nps.gov, and I will provide it to you happily. And please remember that, as Harry Truman would very much encourage me to say, we work for you. You're very kind to allow us to do this, and so I am at your service.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Doug, and thank you everyone for joining us today, and we will see you next time. I will have the video links to you next week, and hopefully all will go well with the links this time around. So thank you all. Have a wonderful day.
Take care. Be safe, everybody.